All right, well, welcome back to another exciting edition of American Hot Rod Association Drag Racing History Channel. As our teaser trailer or snippet implied, we are going to have Steve Maggs on to straighten us out for the entire duration of the evolution of Funny Car from FX class until the flip tops began. So, without further ado, here's Steve. And welcome aboard, Steve.
Yeah, well, thanks, Dallas, and then of course Tony DeFeo. You guys are, Dallas. Of course, you occupy the seat that was once held by Jim Tice, the founder of the AHRA, the American Hot Rod Association, taking on Wally Parks and the NHRA, which I used to work with Gray Baskerville at Hot Rod. He'd say that NHRA stood for No Hot Rods.
No hot rods allowed.
Yeah.
Well, and luckily, the AHRA has a much better acronym, which would be All Hot Rods Allowed, right?
All hot rods allowed.
Right on. Now, the thing with that, of course, we need competition and sanctioning bodies. But when it comes down to the altered wheelbase funny car, the NHRA was not very kind, or, well, they weren't very kind to Chrysler. And what it really came down to, and in fact, there are NHRA documents and even published things saying that, the NHRA was fully aware that it was a spectator sport and they had grandstands full of human beings who probably drove to the event in a General Motors car. Chevy, Pontiac, Olds, whatever it might be. And so when they saw too many Fords or Mopars running away with victory, they'd become a little disgruntled. And in some cases, the gate suffered. So as a result, the NHRA took things like the first altered wheelbase Chrysler funny cars and outlawed them instantly. So we go back to 1965, and I know you guys covered the evolution of super stockers into factory experimental cars. Well,
Yeah, we covered factory experimental. We went right up to about the 1965, the Beeline
dragway. Sure. Yeah.
Right,
Beeline.
So
We just
which is
got
a
to
significant event. Which is a significant event by itself, because that is where the actual term funny car was first used.
Yeah, that's right, Tony.
Yes, Steve.
Yeah, well, initially, the NHRA, apparently they sent out, I think, the inspector, Bill, anyway, it doesn't matter, to Detroit, where Chrysler executives, Jim Thornton and Tom Hoover, said, hey, here's our car for your upcoming Winter National show, December or January of 1965. This is our altered wheelbase Coronet. We got some Dodges and some Plymouths, about 6 of each. How'd they look, guys? Farmer Dismuke, that's the man's name. He says, no, these things are not, they're not acceptable. No. So Chrysler did a quick end around. They built some things called the 2% cars, which were lightly altered, kind of continuations of a handful of cars they built in 64. They looked kind of stock. They were light, plastic doors, plastic windows, that kind of thing. And they were hard tops, not sedans. So they had the thin B pillar, kind of a weird looking car. But if you look at pictures of the 65 NHRA Winter Nationals, you'll see some really weird, like the Melrose Missile, the Ram Chargers car. These are hard tops with a thin roof, but no vent windows on the front, no wind rings, that stuff, and they're Hemi powered and stuff. So that was their band-aid. But AHRA said, hey, we have a show about a month after the NHRA, bring them on over. And that is the Beeline Dragway event in Phoenix, where the altered wheelbase funny cars, the Mopar stuff, showed up. And as you know, the announcer said, boy, some funny looking cars from Chrysler with the altered wheelbase. Of course, rear axle move forward 15 inches, front wheels 12 inches. And that was all about getting better static and dynamic weight transfer on the rear tires.
Who was that announcer? Was that John Lundberg?
That was
it might have been. I think it was. Yeah, I don't know for sure, but yeah, Lundberg, of course, the voice, right? The voice of drag racing, and I think he played both sides of the fence, NHRA and AHRA, and was just for hire. And if you wanted a great announcer, he was it.
He was the guy.
But that was the very first time the term funny car had ever been used, and it was over the loudspeaker, and it was like, look at these funny cars, and that was it.
Yeah,
it stuck.
Yeah, and the beauty of them is they worked. It is true that, say, 1965, Ford's doomsday weapon was the overhead cam 427 in a Mustang, which also had an altered wheelbase, by the way. If you look at the distance between the tire and the door opening, it's really thin. To get big slicks on the Mustang, they trimmed the wheel opening, but largely it was a stock vehicle with a big-ass motor and a 4-speed. And generally speaking, let's say, Gas Rana in his 427 camera Mustang and an automatic Mopar, the Mustang will take about a car length, whole shot, because the Mopars were mostly automatics and torque bite was pretty much well adapted. But bottom line was the altered wheelbase thing works, and it worked so well that within weeks you had people going and taking it. The Brutus GTO, which of course was Lou Arrington and Jungle Jim Lieberman before he became Chevrolet Jungle Jim. But yeah, I mean, the altered wheelbase phenomena treatment works on anything, not just on.
How soon after the Chrysler cars at Beeline did the Holman and Moody long-nosed Mustangs, which, in my opinion, and I'm the Mopar guy, no Mopar guys, right? In my opinion, those long wheelbase Mustangs, those Holman and Moody Mustangs, were the most beautiful machines ever produced.
Graceful, lovely looking car.
Beautiful cars.
Yep. And they kind of, well, go ahead, Tony.
Well, what was the time period between the altered wheelbase Chryslers and the long-nosed Mustangs?
Well, okay, the 65 race season brought us the A990, which was a stock version of the Hemi. Of course, the 12 or 11 or so funny cars, altered wheelbase cars, and the 65 overhead cam Comet and Mustang, both with standard wheelbases. The 1966 race season is when the long nose treatment was established. Okay. And that was for Ford. Mercury took a different tact. They went flip top for 66. So 1966 was the year that the altered wheelbase door slammer from Chrysler, became instantly obsolete when Nicholson and Chrisman and Sharpman got their flip top Mercury Comets, which really were the blueprint for today's flip top fiberglass funny car. And of course, they don't have altered wheelbases because they don't need them. The engine was moved so far forward that they worked very well with a standard looking wheelbase. But believe me, the Logie Brothers chassis might have weighed 800 pounds, the glass body another 500, and that thing might have weighed 16 or 1700 pounds loaded for dirt. Whereas the lightest door slammer Mopar, if you were lucky, 2,400 pounds is about the lightest you get door slammer in.
Those Ford bodies were no jokes. Was that?
Yeah.
Well, they got a 600-pound difference on them. So the Ford, no matter how much horsepower they're making, they're already hurting for you're over to half a second.
Yeah. But the AHRA was the home for the initial Mopar funny cars, and in fact, as we know, the realm of categorized or sanctioned drag racing, whether it's the NHRA or the AHRA, a lot of rules, a lot of regulations and stuff. So what pretty much quickly happened was the racers would have a legal setup for the use maybe 5 times a year, but then they would go match racing. They would just basically go run what you brung with stroker engines, wider tires, and they just gut the cars, trim them down to nothing, and then they'd go match racing or exhibition racing where they could make $500 in a weekend and do that every week.
Right.
So
and that's just that was a takeoff from the gasser match racing, but here's where it really exploded was with funny cars, because there was droves and droves of people coming to see these funny looking cars that were, it was evolving so quickly. You're talking about a 2-year span where if you weren't in with the manufacturer making the newest part, you were left on the trailer. You were the first guy out.
Keep in mind, the beauty of the funny car really was that it had a tremendous amount of brand identification. In other words, if you drove a Chevy Chevelle, the Palomino was there to satisfy you. The Wood Brothers Palomino, which was an altered wheelbase freak of a car with a supercharged 427. If you were a Ford guy, well, there was any number of altered wheelbase Fords or flip-top cars. But again, those flip-top things, they were pretty nuclear. You had to be real close to the factory to get one of those things. Till about 67, when the Logie Brothers started to make frames for anybody who wanted them. But 65 and 6 were the 2 years where the altered wheelbase door slammer blossomed and was blown away in 66 by the flip body tube frame Mercury effort. So it was an amazing 24-month period. It's sort of like going from the Wright brothers to the SST in 2 years. I mean, it's really almost that radical of a change.
From a historical standpoint, there were 3 different starting point. Okay, so the name funny car came from that event in Arizona, but you really have 3 defining periods of time. You've got 1964, right, where you had the Dodge Chargers, which were 3 blown gasoline powered Polaris, and then you had Jack Chrisman, who later on was one of the Mercury factory guys that got. But you had Jack Crispin, who had a Comet, and he built he stuck a blown nitro wedge motor in it before the camera was available to go match race against. So a lot of people credit that as the first funny car.
Yeah.
Then you've got people who credit the altered wheelbase cars, the Chrysler altered wheelbase cars in 65 as the first funny cars. And then you've got people who credit the 1966 Mercury cars, those three flip-top Mercury cars, because they were the first flip-top cars that people identify with as funny cars. So in your opinion, Steve, which of those is the actual first funny car?
Well, I would say, you know, to the majority of people today, the 66 Mercury flip-top Comet Cyclones were the first of the flip-top body blueprints, you know. So a lot of folks, well, funny cars start with Mercury. Well, if we're talking about an altered wheelbase, a strange looking car, a funny looking car, we'd have to say the 65, the Belvederes and Coronets. But again, if you're talking about factory sponsored racers, we're talking the elite of the elite, fighting each other, chasing each other. Well, then we have to go to the Dodge Chargers campaign, where they had, I think, three of those 330 Dodge with the supercharged wedge, and of course Chrisman chasing them. And in fact, I know that the Dodge Chargers had something like a 20 race schedule in the summer of 64 to go around. And of course, they even had a thing where the cars they raced themselves, by the way. The two Dodge Chargers would line up and off they go. It was strictly an exhibition for fans to say, hey, look at Dodge. Dodge is here. Go buy yourself a Dodge. And so Chrisman, with his supercharged Comet, Sachs and Sons, Los Angeles, I believe, was a Mercury dealership. That was their sponsor. But you know that Lincoln Mercury, well, Chrisman used a 427 wedge FX Comet as the bones for that thing. But he would chase the Dodge Chargers and beat their butts because, you know, they didn't get traction. They just burned their way down the track. So that was the first, I think, of the manufacturer challenge between two big companies, you know, Mopar, Dodge, and of course Mercury. That was that. So each one of those three strands is equally fascinating and followable. Which one's the most obscure? Definitely the Dodge Chargers versus Chrisman's wedge car, and of course in the middle of that we have the other. But the flip top stuff, that was where the funny car really blossomed. And sadly, those aren't street cars in any way, shape, or form. But most people identify the funny car with those. So yeah, so it's like anything. The answer is very complex.
Well, what I find interesting is you go from 1965 at Beeline and at the Winter Nationals to, well, essentially as being the first coin use of funny car, right? So that means the Winter Nationals at Pomona, they were no bueno, right? You couldn't have one.
That's right.
To the following year in 1966, in the same, which would be the class, I'm going to do the air quotes there, class, you could have had a 2% car, you could have had an injected altered wheelbase car, you could have had a blown gas-powered altered wheelbase, motor set back like crazy, Sachs and Sons Mercury, and then you could have had a flip-top Mercury Comet. And that would have been the 1 year, all of them racing together would have been I guess the pinnacle of when it was happening.
You have variety.
Well, okay, if you go to that era, the NHRA did have room for what we know as funny cars. Like, for instance, Chrisman's car was run as a C-fuel dragster.
Right.
So the first year that it was out, it was run with the engine. It had a stock front suspension in it. The engine was in the stock location. It was high gear only. And that was the setup that they put together to race the Dodge Chargers, those Polaris. It's always confusing. Dodge Chargers weren't Chargers, they were Polaris. Right. At the same time, actually, you had Bob Sullivan did the same thing with the Pandemonium Barracuda, 1964. He took the engine out. He saw that this was going crazy, so he plucked the motor out of his fuel dragster and dropped it right into it, and essentially completely stock 64 Barracuda, and that was the Pandemonium car. Yeah, that's the Dodge
Chargers right there. That's what they look like, pretty much right there. And in fact, their race season, their schedule is right here. We go this whole listing right here. August, September, October, etc. I mean, that's how many races they had booked right there. And most of those races are where Chrisman showed up to haunt them and make them look very bad.
Well, now Chrisman, wanting to run NHRA events, built the car with rebuilt the car for 65
in red
with a 25% engine setback, so it would be legal as an altered.
Yeah.
But they didn't classify it as an altered. They classified it as a dragster, as a C-fuel dragster.
It was a B. His word was, if you look at it, it has BFD, and he would say, this is built for dragon. That's what he'd say BFD stood for. But there's shots of Chrisman's Comet with its 427 camera. He went from the wedge in 65 to the 427 camera in 60. Sorry, the wedge in 64 to the camera in 65. And it went from white to red and became quite a bit lighter and crazier. But there's many shots of that thing sitting next to a dragster with an injected Hemi, in an open wheel dragster. So the NHRA they had an identity crisis. Well, here's the real thing was the NHRA did not want their almighty dragster to be upstaged by something with doors because, you know, the West Coast, California, there was not a snobbery, but let's face it, the fuel dragster
Central,
yeah, it grew out of, you know, well, Florida, a little man named Don Garnett's kind of showed the world how to put an engine in a rail. But with that said, you know, mostly the fuel dragster thing was seen as an NHRA, their little precious jewel. So they didn't want to have anything with doors, upstage it. In fact, it wasn't until 1969 that the NHRA finally had a funny car eliminator category, I think in the Spring Nationals. So they put it into Match Bash, this sort of mix-all, blend-all thing, which largely attracted door slammers. But for the most part, I think most racers of exhibition cars, whether it's, you know, Brutus or Color Me Gone, or really the numbers, numerous, there were dozens, maybe hundreds of altered wheelbase critters.
They exploded.
Yeah.
There were a lot of funny cars on the West Coast, but for the most part, it was an Midwest and East Coast phenomenon where the West Coast guys, excuse me, the West Coast guys stuck mostly with the open wheel cars, the dragsters and altereds. Midwest, especially in the Chicago area,
yes,
and the East Coast, clustered around New York, went nuts for funny cars. Al Vanderwood, that thing went through a crazy evolution. That started out as that car right there. And then eventually he cut the roof 3/4 of the way off. He left the C-pillars in place.
Yeah.
He extended the wheelbase on it, stretched it, and all kinds of crazy things. And he ran that car up until 1968, I believe.
Yeah. Now the funny thing is, not to derail, but we only have like a half an hour, so I'll try to spread. But this is a book. This blew my mind when I was a kid. I found this at a tag sale. This is like probably the 20th one I've ever had. But this was created in 1966, late 66 for the 67 year. Argus, not Peterson, but Argus put this out. The same guys who do Popular Hot Rodding. Well, in this, for the first time ever, was an article on how to alter a wheelbase. There it is right there.
There you go.
They used Al Vanderwood's car. And they showed how Vanderwood took his 64 race Hemi sedan, this thing right here, and they showed how he butchered the hell out of it, which is what you did. And here it is right here, basically getting sliced and diced and turned into the Al Vanderwood funny car. And this is the very first, here's the before and after and stuff like that. But this is the very first, as far as I know, published report on how to alter a wheelbase. In other words, it became such a thing that it warranted a feature story. Another thing called, I think, 1001 Drag Ideas. They showed how a 65 Pontiac GTO was also altered. But that one was done for some guys in California who wanted a street car, which is kind of nutty to think about. But with that said, I've kind of been a proponent these last 20-something years for building altered wheelbase cars for the street.
You have the book.
I followed that whole entire thing in Hot Rod Magazine with the Wheelchair Shaker, right? And then I ended up
here. Yeah, you know, it's funny, when I got to Hot Rod Magazine, and in fact, I got there exactly on Tuesday, August 19th, 1997, and I left on Tuesday, January 20th, 2004. So I was there for 77 issues of Hot Rod. But when I got there, Ro McGonigal was my editor, and Ro, as you may or may not remember, was on staff at Superstock and Drag Illustrated magazine, one of the best drag magazines of them all. Here's Superstock, the first issue ever. And if you ever see Superstock, that's a great title right there. But Ro was on staff, but he got to Hot Rod Magazine, 1996 or something like that. He says, hey, you know, I want to bring some new people in. So they hired me and Jeff Koch and Terry McGeehan. And I got there, like I say, in 1997. I worked besides great basketball. It was an honor. But when I was there, you know, we were kind of told as staffers, you guys can build a project car if you see it through. And I thought, you know, I'd love to put a funny car back into the consciousness of the world, you know, and why not? And something we can build for the street. So long story short, in 2001, my Wilshire Shaker was about halfway built. And you may remember this cover here. This is the car in primer, or, you know, guide coat. We didn't get it done for a while yet, but that was kind of, you know, my I'm just trying to relight the flame. I won't say I invented anything or anything. I just sort of, you know, shone a light back on the altered wheelbase funny car, but with a twist for the streets. And the thing, like just like a pro street Camaro or really anything, if you build it the right way, you can drive it on the street. I've had 3 of these altered wheelbase cars in the last 20 years or so, and they're as streetable as a brand new Ford pickup truck from 1965. You know what I mean? Imagine putting a 427 in a 65 pickup truck with its beam axle and just drive accordingly, and they're fine. But on the straight in a quarter mile, they're wonderful. They hook up like they should, and they do everything, and they draw crowds. Now, I only went like mid 10s. I don't want to go 8s in a car with the center of gravity of the Statue of Liberty. I don't want to wind up on my head or in the hospital. But I did a book a while back this year, how to build altered wheelbase cars.
And I have that book.
Yeah, and I showed how to slice and dice and make these things, make them happen. So
I actually saw the video that you did with, there's a guy named Dale. Is that his name?
Yeah, Dale Cooch. That's right. Yes.
And
That's right.
I met him out in San Diego. Yeah. He had an altered wheelbase car out there running at Verona.
He did. Yes.
And,
Dodge Dart.
Right.
Now, I could say this for sure. I will guarantee that your handiwork on those cars was better than the quality, the higher quality of what was done with the Amberwagon cars. Because I've actually climbed around underneath a couple of the original 65 cars, and they are a mess under there. I mean, you're talking about bubblegum welds and mismatched things, and
there you go. And the beauty, a lot of folks like this thing right here. This was such a horrible little monster. I love it. The Corruptor's Pup. And this is a non-factory independent drag car. In other words, cars like that popped up all over the country because people realized they could go out and represent Dodge, Chevy, or Ford. Drag strip owners will say, we're going to get a crowd of people in here to see the shootout between the local Mercury funny car and the home-brewed Dodge from the next county over. And these guys made small fortunes, representing their brand with altered wheelbase funny cars of all varieties. And it was
Chrysler offered a kit. They built altogether 11 altered wheelbase cars, the Amberwagon cars, but they offered a kit to the independent racer that had. Indeed. There you go.
Indeed, yeah. This is the technical report, the cookbook, as it were. And in this, they actually give pictures on how they sliced and how they diced. And the crazy thing is, initially this thing was confidential. They did not want Ford or anybody to get an idea of what this was. You can buy these online. This is a photocopy I got from Freiberger. Thank you, David. But it's a thing where it was a thing for a while. And I remember back in the 80s, I'd watch a lot of people. And I remember back, Tony DeFeo, you're a legend in a lot of people's minds. And this right here, you're working these things here was great, but you had a thing, the slam of the month. And sometimes, people with, like triple supercharged Camaro with big fat tires, no differential needed. The sidewalls are glued together. It's a steamroller, but they were useless. But with that said, if that makes sense, so does an altered wheelbase funny car. And people, hopefully they take the bait and build a few of them. If not, that's okay, but they're fun,
Right. Well, and to kind of cover that type of era, I mean, where did we leave off? About 66? How fast did it evolve from 66 onward? I mean, once you got the flip top car, that definitely wasn't the end all be all.
Well, that's right. Well, what happened then, and Tom Hoover, of course, who was the Chrysler engineer who led the team that was in charge of the Max Wedge, the Hyperpack Slant 6, and of course the Hemi. Hoover basically said that when superchargers entered the scene, his interest level left, because in his mind, and I get it, a naturally aspirated engine is truly how you express the craft of making this thing breathe. You throw a blower on a Hudson 6 and it'll do things it never should have. So superchargers in Hoover's mind and some racers' minds was kind of the end of the factory stranglehold, if you will, on racing. So, a lot of racers put blowers on their tube framed cars, and with, maybe a 2,000-pound car and 1,200 horsepower started going 8s and 7s, and, and death traps resulted in some cases, safety being what it was and was not at the time. But with that said, yeah, you're right. 67, 8, 9, it just blossomed. And
right.
The world
If you
of
go to the beginning, there were blown nitro cars in the mix. Right? Again, like Bob Sullivan's car and Jack Crispin's car. And in 65, you had Gary Dyer's deal, where Gary Dyer was running a blown nitro combination. And he actually, that thing ran 865 at Lions in 1965, which is just, I mean, that's just crazy. Okay.
Yes, it
but
is.
Those are the numbers that car was running. But for the most part, up until the middle of 1966, nearly all of the match race cars and the match bash cars were injected on either alcohol or nitro.
That's right. Yeah.
It was beginning really in 66, when pretty much if you wanted to be a player, the end of 1966 into 1967, where if you wanted to be a player, it had to be blown nitro.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exotic fuels, were initially with a carburetor, in super stock land. Again, stock, you had to run stock items, which meant a couple of AFBs, maybe a Holly or whatever it was. But yes, you get into the match race realm. And very quickly, Hillborn mechanical fuel injection on gasoline was the way to go. And they realized, well, alcohol, a little bit of nitro is okay too. So by 66, the carbureted funny car was pretty much a thing of the past. Injected funnies became the majority. And then on the fringe, yes, you started these supercharged. And by 67, 68, the injected funny car became a third string thing, and supercharged match race funny cars were the thing. The Hawaiian, just all these cars that were just fantastic. Seat and Shaker, Jungle Jim, and again, one thing that did arise was, despite the fact that a supercharger will make a diamond out of a dog in some cases, the Chrysler Hemi, especially, and it didn't have to be a 426, because back in 65, 6, 7, 8, a 426 Hemi was like a NASA thing. You couldn't just go buy one. You could find a street Hemi, a wrecked one, and maybe buy the engine. Chrysler sold crates, but racers did find that the early Hemi, the 53 through 58, the 354s and 392s were very adaptable to supercharged racing. Don Garlits, of course, played a big role in making that happen. But a blown 392 in a gutted Dodge Dart, or a flip frame, fiberglass trans Barracuda body with a Logie Brothers chassis, that was an instant 8-second car. And, those things blossomed and became the model of what we now have as funny cars.
So that's all the mainstream. Around the fringe, things really got crazy. Because at that period of time, you had, again, it wasn't defined as a class. It was just really exhibition. It was match bash. So everybody had an idea of what might either A, get to the other end first, or B, get the spectators the most excited. So, and that led to match race bookings, and match races is how you made money. When we were, even into the 1990s, when we were running the Top Fuel Dragster, we made our money on match races, where you get paid to go into a track, put on 2 or 3 runs. That's where you actually got paid. And then you would bring it to a national event and lose everything.
Right.
You know what I mean? Right? But that's besides the point. At that time, you had Garlits shortened up one of his slingshot bodies and dropped a fiberglass 66 dart shell on it, which was like not even disguised as anything really. It was a dragster, and you could see it was a slingshot with the driver way out the back. Was it Class Sanders who drove that car?
Yeah, Emery Cook, or Dale Emery, or Emery Cook. Emery Cook, I think it was, or Dale, one of the two of them. I get the Cook part right, but indeed, that was the polka dart.
Right,
and then of course after that,
came the polka dart afterwards.
Garlits sold critters that. Yes.
You had
but yeah, I mean, so yeah,
the phony pony.
Phony pony, yeah, and just it was a period of just anything goes. Yeah, just stuff where people were trying different things, and sometimes Chevy engines would wind up inside of and here's a 67 or 8 when the stretch nose thing became more generic.
Right.
This is Tommy.
A little is good, a lot is better.
Yeah, and I say that the alter wheelbase treatment can be done to anything and it looks better. Like here's I believe that's if it's fuzzy, let me know. I'll keep moving.
It's fuzzy.
Yeah. But it's just, but the Chevy too, that makes a great funny car. The Chevy Nova does, Well,
what was funny is there's some of them Chevy Novas that were actually in the FX class that evolved into the match bash era. And it's virtually the same paint job. And then you see the engine setback is enormous. The alter wheelbase, including the front and the rear axle, is enormous. And some of them were the original 4-door Novas that were designed for the FX class.
Yeah. And one thing it's fun to do, one of my favorite things is collecting vintage magazines, like like Modern Rod, And some titles, Hot Rod and Carcraft weren't the B end by any stretch. There was a lot of independent magazines. And if you follow like over the course of a year or two, read every one, you'll see cars evolve in print. A great example of that is the Brutus GTO, which launched, I think, in mid-65. And they got a set of Mickey Thompsons, then obsolete from 1963, Hemi heads for the Pontiac. And yes, Mickey Thompson made aluminum heads for Pontiac and Ford FE applications. Well, they put a set of those things onto the Brutus GTO, and it ran pretty well, but they kept blowing up the Pontiac bottom end. So then they said, just get a 392, make it 398, 60 over, and put a blower on it. And suddenly the Brutus was running well. Well, they said, let's make it better. They moved the engine from the engine compartment down. The blower's now in the windshield. The driver goes to the back seat. And you can actually chart the changes by reading about these things in magazines. And I mean, any number, the Sox and Martin, they had the Paper Tiger 2, which was their A990 sedan, which then became semi-altered. They did the back, but not the front. And then they did both ends of the thing. So if you read about these things and get a stack of old magazines, you can actually watch these things evolve. And Tony, to your point about the welding or lack of, it's astonishing. There was one car called Tension, a guy named Cheryl Greer. Yeah, he had, and his son is still alive and well, apparently, and sort of, banging the drum. But Cheryl Greer took a beautiful A990, which, was raw material. And he sliced and diced. He cut the trunk off. It was actually truncated. Yeah, and he drove from the back seat, Model A front axle, and the damn thing won some races, So Tension was a great example of just butchery. But again, the stick welding of the day, they didn't even have, they didn't have what we have today, Miller-Matics and stuff. I bought a Miller-Matic, and suddenly, I call it the finger of God, welding metal together with, with this electrical thing. And it's pretty cool how, now we have the ability to do this stuff. But back then, you're right. I mean, fish plate, stick welding, rivets, it was not.
No, seriously, those cars are a mess. And on top of that, they're acid dipped. So it's like, how they managed to survive even going down the road on the trailer is beyond me.
Like this would start to happen. This is
Grady Bryant.
This is Grady Bryant. Yeah, he wrote a book about his days as a match racer. I forget what it's called. I think it's called Match Racer. But Grady Bryant, the Something Else Chevy 2, it's a great tale about his days and cheating and how they'd put weight in cars and stuff. And yeah, they'd crash once in a while. But it was a great time. It was really kind of the wild, wild west. Almost like the first days of the Moon Project, even like the first days of the jet airplane and Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier and these crazy lashed together machines that killed as often as they worked. Not that that's anything good, but a lot of people they sacrificed. But along the way, just an amazing chart of evolution of these cars. And so I like to just take the camera and stop at 65, 67, and a streetable replica. And you can do the altered wheelbase thing to anything. I've got a 1981 Ford Fairmont, I kid you not. And I always joke around, this idiot who put an altered wheelbase Fairmont together. Oh yeah, that would be me. But it is wonderful, and everywhere it goes, it's way more fun than any stock Fairmont could be. But it runs well, and the traction trick, it hooks up amazingly anywhere. So the altered wheelbase thing does work, no matter what it's on. It also looks cool.